Welcome to a talk on the writing process, from the dangerous method to a recursive model. If you don't know what these terms mean, don't worry. I'll define each of them starting with writing process. Let me offer you two ways of thinking about writing process. Here's the first way. Your process consists of all the mental and physical actions you take to generate a piece of writing. When you wrote your first assignment for this class, did you start by staring off into space, wondering how to start? That's a mental and physical action, so it was part of your process, at least for that assignment. Maybe you got a snack, or lined up your pens, or typed some notes on your phone. If so, those actions would have been a part of your process too. Here's a second way of thinking about writing process. It's the how of writing. How did you generate your ideas? How did you go about organizing those ideas? How did you compose that first draft in a notebook or on a computer or with a speech-to-text program? Your answers to how questions like these can detail your process. One important note before we move forward, there is no single right process. When it comes to process, there is no right or wrong. There is only what works for you and what does not work for you. What works for one writer may not work for another writer. When researchers compare the processes of experienced writers, they see some real commonalities, and I'll talk about some of those commonalities in a minute, but they also see plenty of individual variation. In other words, process can vary from writer to writer, and that's okay. Process can also vary from project to project. For example, the process I use to write a story is very different from the process I use to write a mini lesson, which itself is different from my process for composing a text to my friends. Finally, your process can change over time, and it probably will. After all, you'll grow as a writer and a person, so why shouldn't your process evolve too? What I'm trying to say here is that your process isn't a math problem that has one right answer and you only need to solve it once. Instead, think in terms of a relationship. Your process will evolve over time and you'll always be working on it. As with any long-term relationship, that work will sometimes be enjoyable and sometimes it'll feel like a grind, but it will always be important work. But why are we talking about writing process anyway? I mean, isn't the writing product the only thing that really matters? I'll give you two reasons to care about process. Number one, if you work on your process, your product will improve. According to the National Council of Teachers of English, students who learn about writing process score better on writing tests than students who did not learn about process. Number two, writing should become less painful and more enjoyable. So many students have a process that does not work for them. It's painful and they hate it. But they stick to that process because, well, I don't know why they stick to that process. Maybe it's all they know. But if they learn a different process, one modeled after the common habits of experienced writers, that pain might ease. They might even find some joy in writing. And if the process becomes absorbing and enjoyable, they'll be more likely to keep writing in the long term, which is the real formula for improvement. Now let's look at the painful process commonly used by students. I'm not saying this is every student, I'm just saying this is the most typical process used by students. The writer Peter Elbow calls this the dangerous method. Even if you don't use this method, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It starts with an assignment. The student waits until the night before it's due and then writes a single draft in one sitting. After that draft is finished, they proofread it for grammar and spelling and then turn it in. Done. The process is abbreviated. Just two parts, and they both happen in a single session. High pressure, high stakes. The process is also linear. The student goes from step 1, drafting, to step 2, proofreading. The process is often linear in another way too. Usually the writer starts by writing the very first line and rolls straight through to the ending. Now let's compare this to the stage model process of writing, which you might remember from posters in your junior high. Takes you right back to 7th grade, right? This is commonly called the stage model theory of writing because it represents the writing process as a series of distinct and sequential stages. Distinct meaning each stage is self-contained. When you draft, for example, you just draft. You don't go back to pre-writing and you don't revise as you go. Sequential, meaning that it happens in order. First pre-writing, then drafting, then revising, and so on. Step by step, following the poster like it's a recipe. As you can see, it's just as linear as the dangerous method, but at least it's not so abbreviated. We can call it an improvement. We just can't call it the process used by most experienced writers. Let's look at that process now. Check out all these arrows. The writing process depicted here, modeled after habits common to experienced writers, is definitely not linear. It's recursive. It can jump back and forth between different phases of writing. For example, let's say you're drafting a mini lesson and you realize you need to find a diagram for the recursive writing process. This puts you in research mode, which is part of pre-writing. Once you find the diagram, you realize that you used the term recursive in the title without bothering to define it, so you go back and make a note for viewers to reassure them you'll define it later, which puts you in the phase of revision. Then bam, you're back to drafting. As you can see, the recursive model features more flexibility and more freedom than the linear models we looked at earlier. More freedom and flexibility can lead to more pleasure in the process. This process, as practiced by experienced writers, is also iterative. Iteration is the process of doing something again and again, usually to improve it. Do you remember how the dangerous method featured a single draft? With an iterative process, you can expect to write multiple versions. And when you know you can write multiple versions, it takes the pressure off of any single version because you know you can always improve it with another iteration. Lower pressure equals less pain. In conclusion, the dangerous method is killing you. Your junior high posters were a lie, and the process used by many experienced writers is messy and dynamic and flexible. From here, I'd like you to process what you've learned and what it means for you. Here are some prompts which are also available on our assignment schedule and Canvas. Reflect on these prompts and upload your reflection to Canvas before our next class. Thanks for listening, and I hope you found this mini lesson helpful.